Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. With the recent release of Furiosa, I figured that it would be a good time to talk about a bunch of action movies. So today, I will be doing a tier list. Basically, I'm excluding any comic book movies or overtly science fiction movies with a few exceptions here and there. I scrubbed through my Letterboxd pages to see what action movies I have, and I have seen over 100, so there will be nothing here that I have not seen. It's all in alphabetical order. So the tiers go as told.
If it is to be said, so it is.
We have awful. This is saved for like some truly terrible movies. Bad is just bad movies, not like the worst things in the world. Meh is like a 4, 5, maybe 6 out of 10. And okay is like maybe a 5 or 6 out of 10. It depends on my mood for where I'll place them. A good is maybe about a 7 to a low 8. A great ranges anywhere from an 8 to a 9 for me. An incredible is like my top 10, 15 favorite action movies ever. And the best will be saved for the very end for my favorite action movie of all time. Here we go. First up is Zack Snyder's 300. Now, I'm not really a big Zack Snyder fan. I like a few of his movies, 300 being one of them. Generally, I like the style of this film. The action's very well handled. It's visceral, it's exciting. Characters are a bit thin, but that's not really what you necessarily need out of this type of movie. So overall, I'm going to place 300 in the good tier. Next up is Harrison Ford's Air Force One. This is a pretty fun movie from the 90s with Harrison Ford. We got a really solid villain performance from Gary Oldman, and it's rather consistently entertaining. So I'm going to place this in the good tier. Next up is Aliens, the only movie I will be putting in this tier list because the rest of the movies don't really count themselves as action, nor do I count them as action. The first one is my all-time favorite horror movie, and then the rest are sort of their own thing, but Aliens is definitively an action film. This is one of the greats of all time. I don't know if I like it more than the original Alien. That movie's just perfect, and so is this one. So this is going to be in the incredible tier. It is one of my top 10, top 15 favorite action movies. Next up, we got a rather new film, which is Matthew Vaughn's Argylle. I did not see this in theaters. I saw the reviews and I figured I'll just wait until streaming, and I am glad that I did because I didn't really enjoy this film. I don't know, Matthew Vaughn, what are you doing? This movie felt like it was trying to be too highbrow and lowbrow at the same time, which makes for such an inconsistent experience with some baffling writing decisions. It tries to have twist after twist for no reason when most of them don't make sense or they are really predictable. The action's not nearly as frenetic or as exciting as some of his Kingsman movies, or even movies before he did the Kingsman movies, so this is going to be the first movie in the bad tier. Next up is David Leitch's Atomic Blonde. This movie has a lot of great stuff going for it, particularly Charlize Theron as the lead character, who is really awesome and entertaining. We got a bunch of other side characters who are somewhat memorable. We have the incredible Wunner staircase sequence. That's just an incredible fight scene. It's one of the best that I've ever seen. It's intense, it's visceral. There's nothing else in the movie quite like it. There's a few other solid sequences, but nothing quite on that level. Story-wise, this movie is okay. It's not particularly memorable. It feels very stereotypical, sort of Cold War thriller. So I'm going to place Atomic Blonde in the okay tier. This one's mostly on here for a good laugh, is based on the board game Battleship movie. I saw this in theaters when I was like 11. I remember having a good time in the theaters, but when you're an 11-year-old and you like action movies, if there's action in a movie, you'll enjoy it. So I enjoyed it then, but this is going to be the first movie in the awful tier. This is a truly bad movie on almost every front. It's got all the Michael Bay-isms, even though it's not a Michael Bay movie. It's just a fairly stupid movie. Next up is John Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China. I'm not going to lie, this movie didn't really do much for me, but it is entertaining enough. So I'm going to place it in the okay tier. I don't really have too much to say about this movie in particular. Next up, we have the Daniel Craig era of Bond movies. These are really the only Bond films I've seen. One day I need to go back and watch all of the Bond films, but as of now, these are the only 5 that I've seen, and they're fairly inconsistent in quality. We have Casino Royale, which is automatically going in the incredible tier. This is my favorite of the bunch. I think it is a near masterpiece, if not a masterpiece. It's incredibly thrilling. The plot is intriguing and engaging. All of the character work is fantastic. It has great emotional depth to it. It was such a great introduction to this new version of Bond. And then we have Quantum of Solace, which takes a huge dip and is by far my least favorite of this bunch. It tries to be too much like the Jason Bourne films with quick editing and shaky cam, but instead it comes off as incomprehensible. This was one of those movies that was affected by the writer's strike back in 08, 09, and you can tell. The plot's all over the place, the villain is extremely weak, fairly mediocre action at best, and then we bounce right back with Skyfall, which I'm putting in the incredible tier. Not quite on the level of Casino Royale for me, but it is an epic Bond film. Amazing action sequences, truly euphoric cinematography from Roger Deakins. That man can do no wrong when it comes to visuals. It has a bit of a slower pace to it than a Casino Royale or even a No Time to Die, but it is my second favorite Bond film. Then we have Spectre, which is probably the most divisive of the bunch. A lot of people would put it below Quantum of Solace, but not really high up, even if they had it above Quantum of Solace. For me, I think this movie is okay. It has a lot of really solid action sequences and a lot of solid visuals, not on the level of Skyfall, which is sad because they're directed by the same guy with Sam Mendes. The character work with Bond isn't quite as strong. Christoph Waltz, even though Christoph Waltz is amazing in everything and he gives a good performance, his character is not particularly the strongest, and the pace is a little all over the place. Sometimes it'll move slow, and sometimes it'll move way too fast. But overall, I think the movie is okay. Bond is still a great character, and we get a great character with Madeline Swan. And the ultimate finale of this era of the Bond films, No Time to Die. I love this movie. Not quite in the incredible tier level, but I thoroughly enjoy this film. It's a little long, but it's beautifully crafted. The action is terrific. It's an emotional send-off to this character. Some Bond fans probably didn't enjoy that, but as a person who would not consider themselves a hardcore fan, I really enjoyed it. Next up, we have the Jason Bourne series. I'm going to put the first Jason Bourne in the good tier. The first half of this movie is an incredible thriller and mystery that I feel like loses a bit of steam at the halfway point. There's less action in the second half, it's not quite as exciting, it gets a little slower. The plot's still interesting and the characters are still interesting, but it's not quite as solid as that first hour. Its sequel, The Bourne Supremacy, I'm gonna put a tier above it in the great tier. This is when the series sort of started with that iconic handheld camera, shaky cam style, and for the most part, it really works in this movie. There's one fight scene that overdoes it a bit, but other than that, this is a really exciting and intriguing action thriller. And The Bourne Ultimatum is my favorite of the series. Not quite in the incredible tier, but it is an awesome action movie. All of the action is intense. This movie flies by. The pacing in this film is relentless. We get the best plot of the series. It's terrific. And then we get the Jason Bourne movie without Jason Bourne. I see what they were going for with this movie. It did not work for me at all. I found the Bourne Legacy to be rather boring. Jeremy Renner is solid in the role, and they try and fill in gaps between the series with the other members of this organization, but it just doesn't work. The action is few and far between and not that exciting, so I just did not have that good of a time with this film. Next up, we have the supposed finale of the Jason Bourne films with Jason Bourne. I remember enjoying this film, but to be quite honest, I can't remember a single thing about it, so I'm just going to put it in the meh tier. First in the meh tier. Die Hard, the greatest Christmas movie ever made. Fight me, it is 100% a Christmas movie. We get awesome action, one of the most iconic villains of all time with Hans Gruber. It's set at Christmas, it's about healing a family and a relationship, and it ends with Christmas music. What's not to love? Next up is Dredd. I'm going to place Dredd in the great tier. It has a really good script written by Alex Garland. It's directed really well and really sleek. Maybe a bit too much slow motion for my taste, but that's literally part of the plot is the slow motion. The action is intense and exciting, and Karl Urban is amazing as Judge Dredd. Next up is Edge of Tomorrow. This one sort of blurs the lines between being straight up action or straight up sci-fi. I decided to go with action, and I'm going to put it in the incredible tier. While Doug Liman directed this movie, Christopher McQuarrie wrote the movie, and whenever you team up Christopher McQuarrie with Tom Cruise, you get an automatic banger, because pretty much everything that they have done has been awesome. This one in particular is awesome. The script is really clever, the action is exciting, we get an amazing character that goes against the grain from most of Tom Cruise's performances. Instead of being this outright hero or even a cocky hero like in a Top Gun, we get just a straight up coward who learns to be a hero and to do the right thing. And we get an awesome Groundhog Day concept, but with an alien invasion. Next up is Elysium. I'm going to put Elysium in the okay tier. The movie has a lot of interesting concepts, and it's entertaining enough, but it also sort of fumbles with those concepts and some weird acting. Jodie Foster's accent in this movie is bizarre, to say the least, and her character isn't that interesting. It's sort of a mustache twirling, oh, we can't let the poor get into our society. So it has awesome visual effects, and it tries to say a lot, but it sort of fumbles with the themes, but is overall entertaining enough for me to put it in the okay tier. Next up, we have the Equalizer trilogy. This is an interesting trilogy because they're not quite as action heavy as one might hope, but they are still generally pretty solid. The first one of the bunch is definitely my favorite. Get the most satisfying revenge element and justice element, and Denzel is fantastic in the film. Equalizer 2 and 3 I thought were okay films. Equalizer 2 has a pretty cool finale, and Pedro Pascal can do no wrong. Anything he's in, I'll watch. Once again, Denzel's great. And Equalizer 3, I was a little let down by it when I saw it in theaters. This was the only one I saw in theaters, because it starts off so strong, but it's rather slow and even less action heavy than 1 or 2, which is kind of crazy to say. The story is well done, and the emotional beats are well done, just not really my taste or cup of tea. Next up, we have the 2 Extraction movies, which were part of Netflix. They produced these movies. These aren't really the most memorable action movies of all time, but Chris Hemsworth is great in them, and they deliver amazing action sequences. So I'm going to put the first Extraction in okay. That 11-minute oneer scene is stunning. Any action movie that can manage to pull off a oneer that long will be automatically good in my book. And Extraction 2, I thought was way better than the first one. Story still wasn't amazing, but the action in Extraction 2 was insane. That 25-minute prison escape sequence is genuinely one of the best action sequences I've ever seen in my life. There's clearly a lot of CG and a lot of hidden cuts, but it's so impressively put together that my jaw was on the floor the entire time. The other action sequences are quite well done too. Next up is the recent Fall Guy movie with Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt. Sort of a genre-bending rom-com action movie, Hollywood tribute to stuntmen, so I decided to put it on the list. I really enjoyed this film. It is very sad to see this type of movie horrifically bomb at the box office. Its opening weekend wasn't very good, and neither was its second weekend, but the fact that the studio decided to put it on streaming only 2 weeks after it came out is insane. That's one of the dumbest things I think I've ever seen a studio do. They're losing out on so much, and audiences are being trained to not go to the theater, and they're robbing themselves of that theatrical experience with a movie like The Fall Guy, which is designed to be seen in a theater. The action's great, the stunts are great, Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt have amazing chemistry. It's just a really fun time of a film, and it makes me so sad that it did not do well at the box office. Alright, next up is the Fast and Furious franchise. This series dips all over the place, and for some reason I never saw Fast 3, so that's not on the list. I've seen all of them except for Tokyo Drift, which is Christopher Nolan's favorite movie of the bunch. I don't know why I never saw it, but whatever. I'm gonna put the Fast and the Furious in the meh tier. This movie is aggressively okay. So why not in the okay tier? I don't know. It's not a movie I would ever really particularly care to revisit. It's nearly a beat-for-beat remake of Point Break, but instead of surfing, it's with cars. It's fine. It's the ultimate definition of meh. Too Fast, Too Furious is bad. I did not enjoy this movie in the slightest. I was bored. It's not interesting. Fast and Furious is sort of on the same level as the original. It's getting there. It's getting a little better, but it's still not a great series. Fast 5 finally found its footing and discovered what it really wanted to be. There's a real human connection here, even though it's ridiculous with all the family stuff. And of course the action is crazy and bonkers, like especially with the safe, but this is probably my favorite of the bunch, so I'm going to put it in good. Fast 6 sort of continues on those familial themes and action beats from Fast 5, except they become world-renowned spies for some reason. The action's really good, I'll give it that, so I'm going to put it in the okay tier. Furious 7, I would say, is about on the level with Fast 5. The action gets a bit more ridiculous, but it's ridiculous in that good way where it's really exciting and entertaining. It's also a great send-off to Paul Walker, may he rest in peace, with a very emotional final sequence. I might confuse some people by putting Fate of the Furious in okay and in not meh or bad, but sort of like Fast and Furious 6. As ridiculous as it gets, the action is still well done, and the characters are entertaining enough. Next up is Fast and Furious presents Hobbs and Shaw. This is one of the least memorable of the bunch. All I remember is that The Rock hangs onto a helicopter with a chain from his car, and that Vanessa Kirby's in it. This was one of the first movies I saw Vanessa Kirby in it, and I loved her in everything that I've ever seen her in since the Mission Impossible movies. I think she's gonna kill it as Sue Storm in Fantastic Four. I think that's perfect casting. But for now, Hobbs and Shaw is in the meh tier. F9, the Fast Saga, other than the incredibly pretentious name, is quite bad. Physics just doesn't exist in this franchise anymore. Like, not even in an entertaining way. Like, you're gonna send people to space in, like, scuba gear and duct tape rockets to the side of cars? Like, what? Magnets that make cars fly through buildings? A weak villain with John Cena? Whatever. I thought Fast X was a slight improvement, so I'm gonna put it in meh. It toned down a bit of that ridiculousness, but the story is still all over the place, and really Jason Momoa saves the movie from being as bad as F9. He was quite entertaining as the villain. Next up is the only Rambo movie that I've ever seen, which is First Blood. Now you could probably consider this more of a thriller than a straight up action movie, but I decided to include it. I'm gonna put Rambo in good. This is a surprisingly thoughtful and meditative action movie on the effects of PTSD on a soldier. Like, this aggressively mean police officer just harasses Rambo. He's just trying to exist, and this police officer just keeps harassing him, and then he snaps. And it becomes this series of Rambo killing and trying to act out a warlike scenario with all these cops, while a bunch of them are trying to calm him down and a bunch of them are trying to escalate the situation. It's really interesting, and it has one of my favorite Sylvester Stallone performances. The Fugitive. Now, you could probably consider this more of a thriller than an action movie, but once again, I decided to include it, and this is going in the great tier. This movie rules. The pacing is insanely fantastic. Harrison Ford gives one of his all-time best performances. The story is intriguing, it has a mystery element to it, and Tommy Lee Jones as the antagonist is one of the all-time great action movie antagonists. He's not a villain, but he's the opposing force to Harrison Ford in this film. Next up is one of the least memorable movies on this list. The Russo brothers' The Gray Man, which, to be honest, I remember release dates for like almost every movie. I have weird memory like that. I cannot for the life of me remember what this movie was about, when it came out, other than the fact that it had Ryan Gosling in it and a fun performance from Chris Evans with a mustache. So I think this is like the definition of meh. Here we have one that sort of bends the genre. Maybe it's more fantasy, but The Great Wall. This was just kind of stupid, in my opinion. The action wasn't very exciting. The alien monster things weren't that interesting. Matt Damon is, for some reason, in China, and he's the lead character, but whatever. Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters. The only reason I decided to include this is because I have a fun story with it. This was the very first R-rated movie I ever saw in theaters. I don't know why it was the first R-rated movie I ever saw in theaters, but one day my mom came to me and was like, we're gonna go see this Hansel and Gretel action movie. I heard that it was the best action movie since The Avengers. First of all, no one ever said that. I don't know where she got that info from. Second of all, this movie only came out like 6 months after The Avengers, so that's not really saying much. Third of all, I freaked out because I was like 12 and it was rated R and it scared me. And then we saw it, and it's terrible. We have a good memory based on it, don't get me wrong, but it's one of the worst movies I've ever seen. Okay, here we have probably the first genuine hot take in this tier list, which is Hardcore Henry. This movie has a lot of hardcore fans, one could say, but this movie did not vibe with me at all. It felt like more of a gimmick, and that gimmick was cool for the first 15 minutes, and then it became a little tiresome. So I'm gonna put it in the meh tier. Here we have another one that sort of bends the law of action movie, because honestly I'd probably consider Inception to be more sci-fi than action, but that being said, Inception, if you've seen one of my Christopher Nolan videos, you would know that I adore this movie. This is one of my favorite movies of all time. The story is complex, the characters are complex, the concepts are really well utilized, the action is fantastic, particularly the spinning hallway fight scene. That scene is just amazing. One of the best Nolan films and one of my favorite movies ever. Independence Day. I think Independence Day is slightly overrated. I'm going to put it in the okay tier. It's a fun movie to watch on 4th of July. It's got Jeff Goldblum and Will Smith fighting aliens. Doesn't really do much for me overall, but it's an entertaining time, so okay. Next up, we have the Indiana Jones series. I may have one hot take in here, but not with Raiders, because Raiders of the Lost Ark is one of the all-time action-adventure movies. Introduced us to one of the greatest characters of all time. The adventure is wildly entertaining. Action is fantastic. I particularly love the truck chase. Who doesn't love Raiders of the Lost Ark? Temple of Doom was my favorite as a child. It is no longer my favorite, but I still love it nonetheless. The action might even be better in Temple of Doom. And then we have The Last Crusade, which is my favorite of the Indiana Jones films. I think it has the best heart and the best story of the series. I think it has the best action sequence with the tank chase scene. It might be the funniest in the whole series. I really love this movie. It's one of my top 10 favorites of all time. Can't really go wrong with The Last Crusade. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Everyone knows everything about this movie. It's fairly eh. The first half isn't so bad. But then once you get to the jungle chase sequence with all the cutters and the CGI monkeys, it sort of falls off the map. There's a lot of cool ideas, but it doesn't really resonate with me like a lot of people. So, in the meh tier. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Here is the hot take because I really enjoyed this movie. It's probably too long. Helena doesn't become a particularly likable character until like the last third, which is a little frustrating. But overall, I really enjoyed the meditative nature about this movie. Some people seem to freak out whenever a character ages and isn't this bright-eyed, optimistic character anymore. I don't understand that criticism. I understand some of the time travel elements can be a little much for some people, but I think the way they handled it was just enough for Indiana Jones without going overboard in the way that they did with Kingdom of the Crystal Skull with the aliens. And I thought the very end scene was fantastic. It genuinely made me cry. So I'm going to put Dial of Destiny in the good tier. Sorry, internet. If you want to, dislike the video, but just know that this is my opinion. Jack Reacher, the first of the Tom Cruise and Christopher McQuarrie team-ups, and it's definitely their weakest team-up, but it's still pretty good. It's got an interesting mystery to it. Even though Tom Cruise is way too small of a human being to be playing Jack Reacher, he still nails the physicality of it. The action, while not super often, is fairly well done. However, I did not see the second one, so that will not be on the tier list. Here we have a bunch of Jack Ryan movies. I haven't seen the one with Chris Pine or Ben Affleck, but I have seen 3 of them. The Hunt for Red October is my favorite of the bunch, with the exception of Sean Connery's awful Russian accent. This is a pretty entertaining and thrilling action film. The intrigue stays high, and Alec Baldwin is a fairly solid Jack Ryan. And then we have the next 2 with Harrison Ford, and I'm going to place both of them, Patriot Games and Clear and Present Danger, in the same tier as Hunt for Red October. Next up, we have what has become one of the most iconic and best modern action franchises, the John Wick series. I'm going to go ahead and put the first 3 John Wick movies all in the great tier. The first John Wick came out of nowhere, wasn't a big box office juggernaut, it only made $80 million, but the people that saw it loved it and were blown away, and then we got 2, and then 3, and then 4. When I first watched this movie, I knew it would be good, but at the time, it became my favorite action movie of all time. And then I think I maybe watched it too much, and now the magic of it has faded a little bit, but I still love it. The action is fantastic. Keanu Reeves is perfect for this character. He's not a great actor, but this is the type of character that really suits him. The first John Wick has such a fantastic way to motivate the main character and to motivate the audience to stand with him and want righteous vengeance. You kill a puppy in anything, sorry, but someone's gonna have to delete you, for lack of better YouTube words. And then John Wick Chapter 4, which is by far my favorite of the bunch. It was a top 5 favorite movie of last year. For me, if you've seen that video, go check it out. This movie is nearly 3 hours, and most of it is action sequences, and they're all pretty mind-blowing and amazingly well shot. It's a satisfying conclusion to this current run of the John Wick movies. We'll probably have a John Wick 5 at some point, but we're gonna have the Ballerina film next year, which I'm very excited for. Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill movies, I'm going to go ahead and put them both in the great tier. They are essentially one long movie, so I'm going to connect them. I will say that I think I like Kill Bill 1 slightly more than 2 because it is a little more action heavy. We have the fight scene in the house, we have the anime sequence, and then we have the big black and white scene, which is obviously iconic. But this is a very good throwback, sort of pulpy revenge action series that Quentin Tarantino made, and I'm a huge fan of his movies, so naturally I love these films. The Kingsman movies. The first Kingsman, I think, is great. It's wildly entertaining. I watch it every few years. Remains entertaining. The characters are interesting and fun to watch. The action, particularly in the last third, is amazing. The church fight is one of my favorites in recent memory, even though this movie's almost 10 years old. Kingsman 2 is a big downgrade, but I still thought it was fine. I think it's stupid that they brought back Colin Firth. I think they cheated a little bit with that one, but the action is still solid, and Pedro Pascal, once again, can do no wrong. And then we have The King's Man, which I thought was pretty eh. Matthew Vaughn has been sort of on this streak of going downhill ever since the first Kingsman movie, sort of culminating in Argylle. The King's Man just didn't really interest me, either from a story or an action perspective. Next up we have Tom Cruise and Cameron Diaz in the James Mangold directed Night and Day. I enjoyed this film, so I'm going to put it in the okay tier. It doesn't make sense, it's goofy, it's kind of stupid, but when you put Tom Cruise on a motorcycle, my monkey brain turns on and I just automatically enjoy it. I don't know why. Leon the Professional is going to be in the good tier. I don't think I quite like it as much as some other people do, but it is a fairly solid action film. It sort of has what's become a trope with the father and found daughter story with Jean Reno and a very young Natalie Portman. It's fairly iconic, and Gary Oldman is a great villain. Some classic 90s action films, Lethal Weapon 1 and 2. For some reason, I have not seen 3 or 4, so sorry for that one, but I'm going to place both of these films in the good tier. The chemistry between Mel Gibson, say what you will about him as a person, but he's pretty good in these movies, same with Danny Glover. Now we have the Luc Besson directed Lucy with Scarlett Johansson. Now, some of the ideas in this movie are interesting, but the whole concept is fundamentally flawed, and it plays it out in such a goofy manner that it just became dull. So I didn't really enjoy this. It becomes pretty stupid as it goes along. So there we go. Next up, we have the Mad Max franchise. The original Mad Max is okay. Even George Miller thinks that. He didn't have the budget to do everything that he wanted to. It looks very dated. It's clearly a lower budget. The story doesn't really kick in until the last half hour, 20 minutes. It's not really a movie I ever have the desire to revisit, so it's going in the okay tier. The Road Warrior is a significant upgrade over Mad Max 1. The story starts from the very beginning. The action is terrifically well made. There's still some of that budget limits going on, but they made what they could with this budget, and it's thrilling and exciting. Beyond Thunderdome is okay. I'd say I'd put it about on par with the original Mad Max. It's sort of a tale of two different movies that don't really fit with each other. There's this town segment, and then there's this children's segment that sort of remind me of the Ewoks. I don't know why. They don't really mesh that well, but it's entertaining overall. And then we get to Mad Max Fury Road. which is a top 5 favorite action movie of all time for me. This movie is incredible. Everything about this movie just hits. Simple, well executed story, mind blowing action and stunts, incredible visuals, a score by Junkie XL that makes my heart start pumping. It is everything you want in an action movie. It is stunning. And it brought us one of the all-time great action movie characters with Furiosa, which leads us to the reason why I'm making this video in the first place, Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga. I made a video about this movie and why I loved it so much, and maybe it's a bit premature, but this movie is going in the incredible tier. I loved every second of this film, with the exception of a few wonky green screen CG shots. It's gorgeous, it's wildly entertaining and exciting. The characters are great. Furiosa gets even more depth to her. So when this movie comes out on 4K Blu-ray, I'm 100% gonna double feature this, Furiosa and then Fury Road. It makes Fury Road even better than it already was. Love this film. The Man from U.N.C.L.E. I'm not a huge Guy Ritchie movie fan, but this one was fairly entertaining. It has that classic Guy Ritchie style, and you can never really go wrong with Henry Cavill in a movie. Next up is the Matrix series. Matrix is interesting because the first one is one of the all-time greatest sci-fi and action films ever made. The action's amazing, the philosophy and themes about humanity are some of the best the action genre has to offer. The world building is unique and fascinating. It's an endlessly rewatchable first movie, even though the story isn't fully concluded. And then we get the sequels, which have very large ranges in quality. Matrix Reloaded is okay. Story gets a little overcomplicated, Neo becomes a little bit too much like a superhero god, but it continues that interesting world building, and the action is once again top tier. The CGI in the park fight is a little much, but it's still a well done fight scene. The chalet scene is incredible, with Neo fighting with all the swords, and then the car chase is one of the all-time best, so okay tier. And then we get to Revolutions, which I think is quite bad. The action is quite dull for the most part. It's a lot of just mechs shooting a bunch of flying robots in the middle third of the movie, where Neo is nowhere to be seen with a bunch of characters we don't care about. And then it finally cuts back to Neo and Trinity. Admittedly, there's a very cool fight with Neo and Agent Smith, but it's not really a satisfying ending, and it's mostly fairly dull. And then we have the most recent Matrix film, The Matrix Resurrections, which is about on par, or maybe even worse than Revolutions. It tries to go really meta with like the idea of a legacy sequel and continuing a long franchise years after it's been done. But it falls flat. The action is not nearly as good. The martial arts combat is very quick cuts. It's not terrible with the action sequences, but it's not good either. This one really disappointed me when I saw it because I thought the trailers had a lot of potential to them, so we'll move on. And we finally made it to my all-time favorite action movie franchise, the Mission Impossible series. My very first video on this channel is me ranking all the Mission Impossible movies. I love these movies to death. I could rewatch most of them any day of the week and not be bored and never get sick of them. The first Mission Impossible is great. Before Dead Reckoning came out, and before I did a rewatch marathon of all of these movies, I probably would have stuck it in good, but even though a lot of elements of this film are dated, it has a really interesting pulp vibe to it, and Brian De Palma's direction is really unique amongst these films, and it obviously has two super iconic sequences with the vault heist and the train sequence at the end. Mission Impossible 2 is unfortunately quite bad. As much as I hate to say it. Thankfully it all gets better from here, but John Woo's weird dove and slow-mo style didn't really work for this type of movie in my opinion, so I'm going to place it in bad. Mission Impossible 3 is another banger. J.J. Abrams' first movie, he does a great job. Some of the cinematography is a little mid-2000s-y, too much for me, but the villain's great. Ethan Hunt finally gets something beyond just being an action character. It's a really well-done movie. Ghost Protocol. Oh yeah, incredible. This is when the series really goes from, okay, these movies were good, to this is the greatest action series of all time level. The action in this movie is next level. The Burj Khalifa sequence in the middle is some of the best ever. The climbing sequence is one of the standouts in a series full of standout sequences. And while the finale isn't quite as high profile or as big as the second act, it is still exciting. Rogue Nation, I like even more than Ghost Protocol. Its plot is super intricate and engaging. Ethan Hunt gets a really great character dynamic with the villain, which I think Solomon Lane is the best villain up to this point. The action is once again amazing. All the stuff in Casablanca is incredible with the car chase and the motorcycle chase and the underwater tank heist. The opera sequence is a masterclass in suspense. I love pretty much everything about this movie. Mission Impossible Fallout. This movie's a masterpiece. What else can I say? This is a perfect movie in every way. Incredible characters, incredible story, the best action sequence I've ever seen in my life with the helicopter sequence at the end, or at the very least, my favorite action sequence of all time. I could watch this movie every day for a year and not get sick of it. It has one of my all-time favorite movie scores. Fallout is incredible, and Dead Reckoning Part 1 isn't far behind. I love the Mission Impossible series. Mission Impossible 7 feels like it combines a lot of elements from the previous series. Suspense building, incredible car chases, practical stunts, CG when it's necessary. It has a rather interesting depiction of AI, and I'm very curious to see how they're going to wrap up this storyline in 8, which is now less than a year away. The action is once again top-notch. The train sequence in the last third of the film is just breathtaking. Next up is a rather new film, Dev Patel's Monkey Man. I'm going to place this in the good tier. I reviewed this in my April movies sort of collage review video. I really enjoyed this film. Some of it's a little messy, but especially for a first-time director, it is really solid and really well put together. Next up is Nobody. I have a natural bias towards this movie because I love Bob Odenkirk. Better Call Saul is one of my favorite shows of all time. So you get Bob Odenkirk in a John Wick-esque movie, I'm automatically gonna love it. I'm gonna put this in the great tier. I haven't watched it too much, but the bus scene alone is worth watching this film. Next up, we have Liam Neeson's Non-Stop. This is one of the few sort of generic Liam Neeson action films on this list. Personally, I thought this one was quite good. It's, I guess, more of a thriller than a straight-up action movie. It goes a little off the rails in the last 10 or so minutes with the plane, but this is a really thrilling and engaging movie. That's all I really have to say about this one, to be honest. Netflix is the old guard. Personally, for me, this is one of the better sort of generic action movies that the Netflix production company has put out. The action's great. Charlize Theron being awesome in any action movie will always be a plus. It has some pretty interesting lore as well. I heard that they're making a second one, so I guess I'm looking forward to that one. If I had any real complaints, I'd say one of the side characters who was a Marine, I found her a bit annoying and a little unrealistic as a Marine. Like a Marine wouldn't whine as much as she does. Pacific Rim, Guillermo del Toro's Jaeger and Kaiju movie, is quite good. A little too cheesy for my tastes at some points, but the second half of the movie is just wildly entertaining. Point Break. The original with Keanu Reeves and Patrick Swayze, also known as the better version of Fast and Furious. Admittedly, this is not one of my favorite movies, but it's quite entertaining and a classic for a reason. That cannot be said about the Point Break remake, which is awful. Nothing about this movie is good. It's visually bland, the action is incredibly dull, the Johnny Utah and Bodhi dynamic is just useless. Instead of being surfers, it's about daredevils. It completely gets rid of the unique aesthetic that makes Point Break Point Break. I hated this film, and I normally don't hate movies. The only two Predator movies that I've seen are the original and Prey, in which the original Predator I'm going to put in the great tier. Now, to be perfectly honest, generally I have not been the hugest fan of sort of these 80s types of action movies. They're a little too over the top for my tastes, but I think Predator has a great balance between that over the top 80s nature and that really gritty, sort of intense feeling of 90s action movies and beyond. Especially in the third act where Arnold goes a little feral and blends in with the environment, and it's just him versus the Predator, and that's it. I have similar thoughts with Prey, which I thought was a great sort of reimagining of the Predator universe in a completely different environment with completely different technology, some really solid and interesting characters. It really worked for me. Next up is The Raid and The Raid 2. These movies have some of the best action sequences ever put to film. They are exciting, visceral, and some of the best choreography I have ever seen in any movie. Just period. What Gareth Evans managed to do with the action sequences in these two movies are just utterly stunning. I'm going to put the first Raid in the great tier. What holds this movie back for me is that none of the characters really stand out to me. Story doesn't really grip me, but it is wildly entertaining and the action is stunning. And I have sort of an opposite issue with Raid 2. I think it goes a little too far in the world building, so I'm gonna tie it in the great tier. The Raid 2 has probably the single best fight scene I've ever seen with the kitchen fight at the end. Go watch that on YouTube or something if you can, or watch the whole movie. I recommend that, obviously, because it's a great movie. It's 2.5 hours versus the first Raid being 100 minutes. I think that the Raid 2 has a little bit too much story building and character building and world building for what it's really trying to go for. And that's what holds it back for me a little bit, but the Raid 1 and 2 are amazing films. Now, I put these next two on the list more for a laugh than an actual serious placement in the list, because they're more sci-fi than action. But Zack Snyder's recent duology, Rebel Moon, Child of Fire, Part 1, whatever it's called, and Rebel Moon Part 2, the something, these movies are god-awful. I hated every second of these films. None of the characters are interesting. It's visually muddy. It's very ugly. Normally Zack Snyder's aesthetic doesn't really appeal to me, but he has a good knack for certain shots. I don't even think he does that well in these films. Rebel Moon 1 is just this compilation of recruiting a bunch of characters that we don't get to know ever, even in Part 2. And then it just ends, and then the villain dies, and then he's brought back to life immediately. And then Part 2 is somehow worse, with the most flawed, basic action movie setup ever. It's trying too hard to be Star Wars and Seven Samurai at the same time, and fails at both miserably, with dull, uninteresting characters, dull, uninteresting action sequences, dull, uninteresting world and visuals. Like the whole concept of like an emperor wanting to find this specific person because they did something specifically bad to them is fine, but then the other concept of this empire and this particular admiral going after this one village for a bunch of grain when there's a whole galaxy of other places that they could probably get other grain as well is so flawed and confusing in my opinion that it's just not worth watching these at all. Next up is an actual good film in RoboCop. Admittedly, like a bunch of other 80s films, doesn't connect with me as much as it does for some other people, but RoboCop is still an interesting movie. The action is very 80s and very over-the-top violent, but the lead character and sort of figuring out who you are if you died and you're put in this sort of fake body, fake life, like what does that mean? Are you still yourself? Has a lot of interesting questions about it. RRR is the only Indian movie that I think I've ever seen. I saw it back when it came out on Netflix and there was all this hype for it, so I figured I'd watch it, and it's really good. It's 3 hours, but it's really entertaining. It keeps up that entertainment. The action is over the top fun. It's really well done. This is a great film. The friendship between the two characters is really wholesome, to be honest. It gets complicated, but it's genuinely wholesome. It's a really good movie. I highly recommend it. Next up is Safe House. This is an okay film. It has a fairly interesting concept of trying to protect this sort of traitor to the United States. Gets an interesting friendship dynamic out of Ryan Reynolds and Denzel Washington. Other than that, it's not particularly memorable. Not something I'd revisit. Speed is awesome. This is one of the all-time classic action movie setups. A bomb on a bus, and if it goes below a certain speed, the bomb blows up. It maintains a level of excitement that most action movies can't do for 2 hours. It's a wonderful film. Taken. I have only seen the first Taken, and from what I've heard about Takens 2 and 3, that's probably a good thing, but I quite enjoyed the first Taken film. It's not some masterpiece, but it's a very satisfying revenge movie about a man connecting with his daughter again. And that's all it really needed to be. Tenet. A very wild Christopher Nolan movie that I love, even though it makes no sense to me. A lot of it does make sense to me, I lie. But it's really confusing and hard to follow at some points. The sound mixing is all over the place, but it's so wildly inventive and entertaining to watch that I watch it every year or so. I think Tenet is great. Starship Troopers, also known as the movie that confuses morons, because this is a great movie and a great satire of fascism. In fact, it is so obviously in your face satire of fascism that you'd have to be a moron to not realize it. And there was this huge discourse on like Twitter and stuff when Helldivers 2 came out about the satire of this film, and it made me feel like my brain was rotting because of how many bad takes I saw. Anyway, the movie's great. Solid characters, fun action. It's a classic. Oh boy, here comes, without question, the hottest takes in this entire list. I'll put a timestamp on screen for if you don't want to hear me talk about the Terminator movies and not hype them up like I have with some of these other movies, because they didn't really connect in a way that I wanted to. And that really sucks because I've seen Terminator 2 quite a few times, and I really want to love it, but I don't know why it just doesn't connect. That said, I'm going to put the first Terminator in the good tier. Solid concept, solid action for the most part. A really annoying score, I found. I don't like the music in these first two movies. I found them more distracting than thrilling. It's just not a movie that I really connected with, but I think it's a good film. Similarly with Terminator 2, which is blasphemy to say in the film fan and action film circles. I know, dislike the video all you want, I guess, but just know that this is an opinion that most people don't share, and I am very well of the fact, and I don't like to boast it. I'm genuinely sorry that I don't love this movie. I really want to. However, I will dunk on the rest of the Terminator movies like everyone else does. Terminator 3 is hilarious in all of the wrong ways. It's entertaining in all of the wrong ways. I thought it was hilarious. And then Terminator Salvation is just kind of boring. They take a really interesting aspect of this world and the interesting characters in it and make it a fairly generic military type mid-2000s gray-ish movie. It's easily my least favorite of the bunch. And then maybe another hot take. Maybe it's because of my connection with the series not being as deep as some other people, but I thought Dark Fate was okay. Not a horrible travesty that some people think it is. Not this great follow-up that I've heard some people say. I thought it was fine, entertaining enough. Next up is the original Top Gun. I think this movie is also okay. When I watched it, it didn't really do anything for me. I was entertained, probably like a 6 or 7 out of 10 for me. Not really a movie that I would revisit, but it introduced us to iconic things like Danger Zone, Maverick, Iceman, Goose, Talk to Me Goose, all these classic things, and an iconic Tom Cruise performance. But thanks to Top Gun, we have Top Gun Maverick, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. It takes everything that was good about the original Top Gun and makes it better. The action is amazing. The visual effects, the combination of digital and practical plane effects are amazing. It's thrilling. The final third of this movie is one of the most satisfying and exciting things that I've ever experienced in a movie theater. There's a reason why this movie grossed $1.5 billion. It's emotionally satisfying. It's consistently exciting for 2 hours. Maverick gets such a strong character arc in this film, and the new characters are great too, like Hangman and Rooster. I love Top Gun Maverick. I've seen this movie numerous times, and I can't say the same about the original. Total Recall. This is a good film. Another sort of iconic Paul Verhoeven action film. A little goofy and over the top at points for me, but it introduces some interesting questions. True Lies, James Cameron's sort of forgotten about a little bit action film. This is a great movie. It's silly, it's goofy, but it's also really entertaining and thrilling and emotionally satisfying as well, where this couple sort of reconnects through this experience. Took them forever for them to put it on Blu-ray for some reason. I don't know why that took so long. Next up is Uncharted. I only have 3 more movies. Thankfully, this video is going to be too long as is. Uncharted is the ultimate definition of meh. Everyone is miscast. The adventure aspect is sort of underthought. Feels like somebody could have found these things real easily anyway. The action's fine. Tom Holland, while he's miscast, is fine. It really hurts because I'm a huge fan of the games, Uncharted 4 being my favorite of the bunch. But I wasn't mad while watching it. It's not a movie I would say is actively bad. It's more disappointing and unmemorable. Upgrade is a great and really interesting sort of sci-fi action film. At first, it's not really an action film, but once he gets sort of this AI uplink into the lead character, it becomes this action film with some of the most unique action camera work I've ever seen. I highly recommend you check it out. It's really good. And the very last movie on this tier list, Violent Night. This movie knows exactly what it is. It's a goofy, die-hard sort of rip-off where Santa kills a bunch of criminals and he regains faith in himself. It knows exactly what it is, it's entertaining and over the top, and David Harbour kills it as Santa. Since that was the last film on the tier list, I need to pick out my favorite action movie of all time, which, if you've seen my Mission Impossible video, you should know my favorite action film of all time is Mission Impossible Fallout. This is a top 5 favorite movie of all time for me. I think it's perfect. in pretty much every way. Let me know where you agree with me or where you disagree with me. Feel free to send really mean things to me about my Terminator 2 take. I'm kidding. Please don't do that. Obviously, you can disagree with me on my Terminator 2 take. Most people disagree with me. I'm trying to be as cordial about it as possible because it is a film that I want to love, but I just don't. I love these types of movies. This was a lot of fun to talk about. It's going to be a nightmare to edit, but it was a lot of fun putting it together. Let me know what's your favorite action movie of all time, maybe top fives, and remember to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, be a great help. Let me know any ideas about what you might want me to talk about next. I will for sure be doing an Inside Out 2 review and A Quiet Place Day 1 reviews when they come out in a few weeks. That's mainly why I wanted to do this video, because Furiosa was coming out, and it hurts my soul that it's not doing well at the box office. I know Mad Max isn't a super popular franchise and it's a little more niche, but it still hurts my soul that a movie that good isn't doing so hot. Let me know your thoughts on that film, any of my opinions that you might disagree with, because that's guaranteed to happen and that's perfectly valid. But remember to give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, give a comment or two if you want, and stay tuned for what's next. Okay, bye.
If it is to be said, so it is.